we're starting about right now, since a lot of the attendees are really very excited to hear from our panelists. So first of all, good afternoon everyone. Magandang hapon kanayon, magandang hapon sa lahat. I am Laya Bukiren. Welcome to Nayong Filipino Foundation's Umpukan sa Nayon, No Object Unturned. So we are celebrating not just the Museums and Galleries Month, but also the 23rd year of Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, or IPRA, with the theme, Correcting Historical Injustices for Indigenous Peoples' Rights and Welfare. So how timely that we have this umpukan right now. Nayong Filipino is a GOCC that aims to be inclusive and participatory in the implementation of our programs. So that's the reason why we are gathered here like this, to seek recommendations and suggestions on our permanent collection for the museum that we intend to have. So the Nayong Filipino Foundation has a collection of around 2,762 artifacts as of this time that we're going through all the inventories once again. So they were previously housed in the Philippine Museum of Ethnology. It was part of the old Nayong Filipino Park in Pasay. And when the park was relocated to Clark around 2007, the collection was moved to the new location, with most of the artifacts going into storage because of lack of space. The textile collection was briefly put on display at the Nayong Filipino Clark. Just a bit of the story, our collection story. So a lot of you know, especially if you work in the museum field or in the field of anthropology, archaeology, most of you know that under the authority of the Presidential Assistant for National Minorities, or the PANAMIN, the Museum of Philippine Traditional Culture was inaugurated sometime in 1971 with an aim to present, at that time, the so-called cultural heritage and lifestyle of national minorities. Of course, Nayong Filipino Foundation's history itself goes a bit earlier than 1971. So anyway, after PANAMIN's dissolution, the museum was renamed to the Philippine Museum of Ethnology. And much later, the artifacts of the Nayong Filipino collection were recently inventoried by the Nayong Filipino Foundation Museum staff sometime in 2019. My colleague later can tell you more about how many inventories have been done. Anyway, prior to this most recent inventory, an inventory was also conducted last June 2018 by students of the Department of the Behavioral Sciences of the University of the Philippines in Manila. And before that, a partial inventory of around 1,000 artifacts was done in 2016, supervised by the National Museum. So from the initial assessment of the NPF collection, there seems to be a distinct lack of information on the sources of these artifacts. We also need more information on the vernacular nomenclature, acquisition details in the current inventories. From the information that we have, an estimated 80% of the collection is documented to have come from communities in Mindanao. So we have Maranao, Tausug, Yakan, Subanen, Bilan, Maguindanao, Mandaya, Mansaka, Talaandig, Higaonon, Sama, Manobo, and several other communities from the north like Bontoc, Apayao, Ifugao, etc. documented in the inventories. Before we proceed any further and dive deep into the discussion, I would like to request our Executive Director, Attorney Kay Malilong Isberto, to officially welcome our attendees and panelists.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We at Nayong Filipino are very happy to have you with us for this round of Umpukan. So as you know, we hope to be able to build our park in Parañaque City. And this collection will be among the things that we will find in that future park. So Nayong Filipino is a government corporation created in 1972, a creature of martial law. And it has the mandate to conduct research in social science and the humanities. It aspires to be a recognized hub for research, innovation, and training on cultural heritage. So as an agency tasked to do research, we have a lot of questions. And finding answers to these questions is something that we hope to do today. We hope that today's activity will be a catalyst for the creation of a strategic roadmap for safeguarding heritage, especially the heritage of Indigenous peoples and cultural communities. So many things have changed since the Nayong Filipino collection was acquired. Some practices that were acceptable or not questioned at that time are probably considered unethical today. So even the definition of a museum is now the subject of intense debate among practitioners. Also, we now have a 23-year-old Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, a law described by the Supreme Court as being enacted for the purpose of correcting historical injustices. This law emphasizes cultural integrity and the right to self-determination of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous cultural communities. It talks about free, prior, and informed consent. So it's probably not wrong to ask if this law had been in place at the time the Nayong Filipino collection was being built, what procedure would have been followed? And then given that it's now 2020 and we have this duty under the Constitution and under the IPRA to take better care of Indigenous heritage, what do we do about the Nayong Filipino collection? We know that as a government agency, we have a duty to protect, promote, and safeguard heritage. We also know that we have a long way to go before we can say that we are successful in doing so. The list of challenges is a long one, and it's found in Chapter 7 of the Philippine Development Plan. So this afternoon, we hope that it will bring us closer to success, and I'd like to thank all our panelists and our viewers for being here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Attorney Kay, for that warm welcome. I would also like to introduce my colleagues on board here at the Nayong Filipino Foundation. So they are Patricia Panganiban. She is our Materials Conservation Specialist and she officially heads the NPF Virtual Museum Project. We also have on board Kate Lim. Kate specializes in archaeology. She is also in Tuklas Pilipinas, and she heads the Cultural Leadership Institute of the Nayong Filipino Foundation. I'd also like to introduce Ian Mejia. He is on top of programs in Nayong Filipino Clark, where most of our objects are, our permanent collection are. So he is supervising the manpower, the groundwork that our staff does on site. And we also have on board our project officers helping us in the implementation of the projects and helping us do research and move forward with our multi-sectoral consultations. So this afternoon, we are also honored to have guests from Ateneo Davao, Ayala Museum, the Cebu City Cultural and Historical Commission, the UP Diliman College of Music, and of course, the International Council of Museums in the Philippines, and the UP Department of Anthropology. So let me just introduce our esteemed guests for them to greet the audience. First, we have Romulo Vinci Bueza. He is the director of the Ateneo Internationalization for Mindanao, or AIM office, from the Ateneo Davao University. Vinci is currently the assistant to the president for external affairs. He's also the corporate secretary of the Ateneo de Davao University. He serves as the Madaris Volunteer Program of the Catholic Educational Association of the Philippines as its lead coordinator. So ladies and gentlemen, and a virtual applause for Vinci Bueza. We also have on board Marinela Mina, or Tenten Mina. She is the associate curator of the Ayala Museum. I saw guests from the Ayala Museum registering for Umpukan sa Nayon, so thank you very much for supporting us. Marinela Mina is an associate curator and she specializes in tradeware ceramics and indigenous Philippine textiles. She obtained her BFA in Arts Management from the Ateneo de Manila University, and she's currently working on her Master's in Archaeology at the UP Diliman Archaeological Studies Program. So mga kanayon, we welcome Marinela Mina. We also have Dr. Jose Semblante Buenconsejo. He is a professor of musicology from the University of the Philippines College of Music. He has researched on the Agusan Manobo rituals and has examined them from a particular historical point of view on the materiality of communication. So he has a publication called Songs and Gifts at the Frontier, Persons and Exchange, published by Routledge in 2002. He also published an inaugural essay on the cultural history of late 19th century Ilustrado piano music in Philippine Modernities from the UP Press in 2017, and it won the Best Book in the Social Sciences in 2018, given by the Philippine National Book Development Board. Dr. Buenconsejo is an alumnus of the University of the Philippines from musicology. He also took his master's at the University of Hawaii in ethnomusicology, and he earned his PhD in the anthropology of music from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Buenconsejo was Dean of the UP College of Music from 2010 to 2017 and is currently the liaison officer of the International Council of Traditional Music. It's a pleasure to learn from you once again, Dr. Buenconsejo. We also have on board, among our panelists, Dr. Jocelyn Guerra. Dr. Guerra is a graduate of AB Sociology Anthropology and MA Anthropology from the University of San Carlos, Cebu. Dr. Guerra received her doctorate in archaeology from the University of Prehistory and Early History at Hamburg University in Germany. She is currently engaged with the Cebu Chinese Heritage Museum in Cebu City as curator and consultant. Dr. Guerra also serves as a consultant on tourism development of the city of Mandaue, as well as a commissioner for the Cebu City Cultural and Historical Commission. She is an advocate for heritage conservation by popularizing museums and heritage to the public through cultural programs across sectors. And she believes in partnership with communities to plan for museum and heritage narratives and tourism development. We would very much want to have your inputs. It's the same thing that Nayon wants for its programs as well. So let's give a warm welcome and virtual applause to Dr. Jocelyn Guerra, everyone. Last but not the least, we have Dr. Nestor Castro, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Philippines, Diliman. So he specializes in cultural anthropology. His research interests include ethnicity and indigenous peoples issues, environmental and social impact assessment, and cultural heritage management. His works have been published in notable journals such as New Asian Visions Colloquium, The New Horizon of Contemporary Sociological Theory, Philippine Social Sciences Review, Kasarinlan, and Diliman Review. Dr. Castro did field research in several indigenous communities in the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. Dr. Castro's thesis was on the communist movement in the Cordillera region, and his PhD dissertation was on the politics of ethnic identity in Kalinga. He served as chair of the Anthropology Department, Associate Dean of the Colleges of Social Sciences and Philosophy at the CSSP, and Vice Chancellor for Community Affairs of UP Diliman. And he also served as a Vice Chairman of Ugnayang Pag-aghamtao, UGAT, no, and Vice Chairman of the National Research Council of the Philippines Social Sciences Division, and Southeast Asian representative of the International Commission for Rights of Aboriginal Peoples. Currently, he is president of the International Federation of Social Sciences Organization and the International Council of Museums. So a warm welcome to Dr. Nestor Castro. It's an honor and privilege to have you, sir. At this point, we will now start the discussion, and with me are members of the NPF team, Patricia Panganiban, Kate Lim, and Ian Mejia. So I'd like to remind everyone, the attendees, if you have any question, you can use the Q&A box to type in your questions. Our project officers will assist you if there are questions that they can answer based on the fact sheets that we have. And you can also ask questions directed to particular panelists that we have on board this afternoon from among our experts. And we'll do our best to answer the questions that you have for NPF as well. So, awesome, everyone. Let's begin with the questions that we have for our panelists. So, for the first question, I'd like to invite the panelists to give our inputs regarding how institutions like the Nayong Filipino Foundation can confront the history of our permanent collection and also raise issues on ownership, rights, and ethics. So, to begin the roundtable, can we ask any one of the panelists to give their inputs? Can we have, just to do the rounds, can we start with Vinci Buesa?
Maayong hapon sa tanan. Just marahay na aga. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be among the panelists. So I think I'll really start with the central function first of museums and similar institutions like the Nayong Filipino Foundation with collections. So heritage preservation and interpretation, that those are the central functions of museums. And these functions obviously are the most public dimensions of museum practice. However, certainly in recent years, no, indigenous peoples and many advocates have been raising the alarm about the legitimate limitations of museum display as a means of expressing and preserving culture. They would say that culture is a living process, and I agree. Culture is a living process that incorporates both continuity but also change. Culture changes, it transforms. No? And these advocates actually are saying that museums have become cemeteries of objects, no? Merely a storage. So if you ask indigenous peoples, um, they would say that culture is a living, dynamic, ever-changing, and yet ever-constant thing. It is a story, a song, a dance, performance, and it's never a dead thing. And sometimes they're represented in the form of an artifact, and these artifacts, unfortunately, are just looked at through glass. No, the urgent need now is to give emphasis on the preservation of the context. So it's very important that I think the Nayong Filipino Foundation should preserve the context and the associated activities, not just the object itself. And this involves re-socialization, the re-socialization of objects. So I'm not just talking about repatriation of these objects, no? If that is ever in the horizon of the Nayong Filipino Foundation. I'm talking about the re-socialization of objects, their return to the place of origin, where the intangible aspects of heritage provide the meaning, and where the objects themselves may stimulate renewed activities of the intangible aspects of the culture. So this perspective emphasizes the importance of ceremonial objects for intergenerational knowledge transmission. That's very important, especially for indigenous communities, the intergenerational knowledge transmission, and for preserving and renewing the intangible aspects of this heritage. So if ever there is repatriation that the Nayong Filipino Foundation will be doing in the future, it is not just the objects that are being returned, hopefully, but we are also returning the means to transfer and perpetuate indigenous knowledge. The challenge that the Nayong Filipino Foundation would have to face is how to facilitate the preservation of objects within the context of their broader social and cultural significance, and how to develop strategies that offer the best protection and utilization of these resources to the benefit of all humankind. This involves serious consideration of why we preserve things and for whom. These are questions that the Nayong Filipino Foundation might have to ask themselves. No? It requires museum staff to look beyond their institutions and the local community and recognize the values and needs of the source communities of where these artifacts, these objects have been taken, and to consider the contribution that museums can make to the society as a whole, and not just to the museum visitors, may it be physical museum or virtual museum, and also the academic community. Museums can play a new role in supporting and contributing to the processes of cultural renewal. There are communities, especially here in Mindanao, who are doing this, who are undertaking the process of cultural renewal, but also to healing and reconciliation across peoples and generations. So my four recommendations for the Nayong Filipino Foundation to confront this shadowy history of the permanent collection would be, number one is to act as a supporting actor in initiatives for reconciliation and healing, especially here in Mindanao. There are now, with the passing of the Bangsamoro Organic Law, there is now a Bangsamoro government. There are initiatives for reconciliation and healing. There is now a commission for transitional justice and reconciliation. The Nayong Filipino Foundation can take the supporting role. The return of objects, if it's possible for the Nayong Filipino Foundation to return these objects, that could be that could have a big impact for communities where these objects were taken. And usually, most often, these communities have been victims of systemic oppression in the past, and still happening actually here in Mindanao. So the return of objects and the process that comes with it can help in the healing of peoples here in Mindanao. No. The second thing would be if the Nayong Filipino Foundation, if it's possible to be the convener for dialogue, such as this, the Umpukan, no? To continue these spaces where people can dialogue, but not just in the level of experts or the level of panelists, but perhaps, and it's more important, to convene people in the ground, to listen to the stories of the people. No? And the third thing would be for the Nayong Filipino Foundation to be an enabler for research. There are still so much things that need to be researched, especially the collection of the Nayong Filipino. To be an enabler means if you have the money, then fund the research, but also to collaborate with the academe for researches. Ateneo de Davao University is willing to help the Nayong Filipino Foundation for this project. And then the fourth one, I think, would help the Nayong Filipino Foundation to confront its history would be to act as a lead advocate for the resocialization of some of these wrongfully taken objects, no? The resocialization. And later on, I'll talk about, especially when we go to the question about the virtual museums, on specific things that the Nayong Filipino Foundation can do. So going back to the central function of the museum as assisting in heritage preservation, actually the return of objects wrongfully taken can assist indigenous peoples who are continuing or renewing their values and practices essential to their cultural and ceremonial life. Then the act of returning objects to their original communities is surely the ultimate form of heritage and cultural preservation. That's it from me.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for these insights, Vinci. I am getting keywords like the Nayong Filipino as supporting actor for reconciliation, convener, enabler. I really like the idea of collaborating more with academe and more communities. I hope I can count on Ateneo de Davao University and we can have more collaborations together. And Nayong Filipino definitely as a lead advocate and supporting actor for reconciliation. Yes, I think it's about time. And you also brought another keyword a while back, the issue on repatriation. Vis-a-vis the Nayong Filipino Foundation as a supporting actor, maybe we can also think, no, as panelists, among panelists and attendees, what do we do concerning these concerns on repatriation? Several weeks ago, we had another consultation with Bing Carino, and we talked about the issue of repatriation and the concern regarding some of these objects finding their way back in the market in case it happens. Now, so let's hold that thought a bit, and perhaps we can ask also the insights of our other panelists. Can we have insights from Tenten Mina?
Okay, so first of all, thank you to Nine Filipino for organizing this, and I'm very honored to be part of this panel. Now, regarding your questions of the history of the collection, I think that it's, well, my perspective here is really more on provenance studies related. And I think it's about looking at museums as long-term institutions of memory, not as repositories of just objects. It's also really part of the duties of a museum to really retain all information with regards to objects. And with regards to the provenance of these collections, that's not just referring to a list of names where the objects were sourced, but even the context of who these people were. Where were they coming from? Were they dealers? Were they artists? Were they the craftsmen themselves? What was the context of the entrustment of the collection before it finally found its way into the institution? And this is a very difficult question really to tackle. And it's something which a lot of institutions are really coming to terms with, not just museums, even libraries. There was a talk a few weeks ago where the Royal Geographic Society was also talking about decolonization of maps which were made during the colonial period. But I think that what I'd really like to emphasize here again is that, well, I suppose I come from a different stand than Vinci, because I don't think that there is necessarily a need to repatriate objects unless the community, which is directly linked to the materials, asks for it. Because the question here is also related to the representation of not just the aesthetic values of a people, but their entire worldview. That is what is manifested really, especially in ethnographic materials. So when we talk about the repatriation of objects, the question is it the same community? Because communities evolve over time. I think it was a few months ago, there was also a discussion on a similar topic at the Association of Art Museum Curators, and there's a German museum with a large holding of ethnographic materials from Mejia in Malaysia, and they had actually engaged with the local community asking if they wanted materials repatriated, and the community said, no, we're now Christian. We don't want anything to do with these materials. So another question here is, should an institution, what does an institution do with a collection like that when the views of the people have also themselves evolved? So I think that one of the primary duties really of institutions is to keep that information, keep all of these contexts for future consideration of other generations, because as we're also seeing, as mentioned by Attorney Kay, is that practices and how we view practices evolves over time. So even our own interpretation of what is ethical might be evolving even within just a few years. And I think that's something that's become very evident in many sectors across the globe, where even business practices are being questioned on a larger scale. So with that, I'd like to also emphasize that when we do provenance studies for museum collections, we're not, first and foremost, this is, again, it's a continuous practice because the information evolves. And second, it's multi-layered, because as multifaceted as objects are in themselves, then there are so many other tangents of connection that can also be retraced back to these objects. And it's also a collaborative effort, as Vinci had said. So I think that those are the first 3 points I'd like to stress for your first question.
Thank you for these insights, Tenten, on the need for multi-layered and multifaceted provenance studies that we're trying to do in Nayong Filipino at present. Later, before we proceed to the other questions, I will be asking Patricia Panganiban to just briefly talk about what we have for the benefit of the public. But before I do that, I'd like to hear from Dr. Buen Consejo.
There's a concept or principle that might circumvent the idea of ownership, because the ownership that seems to be understood is in the context of private property, public-private property. Now, this is a concept in economics called public good. And a public good is one in which the consumption does not prevent others to consume. In other words, this concept of public good is similar to the idea of Creative Commons, in which there's a sharing of resources. So this public good also means that one's consumption of an object does not exclude others to consume the same object. So of course, the typical examples of these are clean air, or a street lamp, you know, which lights the street at night. So if there's that public good in our streets, then the benefit should be common to all. So I see heritage more as a public good and not a commodity or a market thing that should circulate with a price tag, but it's something so valuable because it is linked to our to the identities of the communities. So this idea of public good might contradict the idea of repatriation if we look at the museum as a place which simply safeguards this for the benefit of all, and then the museum acting like a midwife to the voices from indigenous people. So the idea of public good, I'm just beginning to understand what it is. It has something to do with attending meetings in the National Research Council of the Philippines, that I'll just continue documenting, you know, and sharing it in public. And so far, the communities know what I'm doing. I mean, they feel proud about what I'm doing because as much as possible, I do not interpret their traditions. I let them speak, you know. I'm just sort of a medium for all this representation to pass through me, and then I put them in public without, but at the same time knowing that it was me who mediated it. So I don't know if the concept of public good might be helpful in might be a solution to this conundrum of ownership. I'm pretty sure being a GOCC, Nayong Filipino does not really, I mean, owns it in a sense that, you know, this has been inherited from past practices, but the heritage that we're talking now is being interpreted. By the way, I'm not an expert in heritage studies, but somehow I just find some logic into like our relationship with this collection, you know, that has been handed us to us. So I think if we consider them as a public good and not a market good, a commercial entity that, you know, that generates profit, of course, in safekeeping them, it's the government giving money to the institution so that these public goods are safeguarded, you know. So I don't know, maybe we should study more about this concept of public good, because I think it's similar to the idea of clean air, you know, in which everyone benefits. One person breathing clean air does not mean excluding others because others share the same space, you know. So I don't know if heritage, construing heritage as a public good might be a direction to go. That's my answer to your first question, Dr. Bukirin.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Buen Consejo. Dr. Buen Consejo raised a very important point here, I believe, on the museum as a convergence point, a nexus of voices, and the need to let communities speak. And the concept of public good in heritage would very well figure in how we share the resources, the knowledge resources we have. And the Nayong Filipino Foundation also puts a prime importance on inclusivity and participation. And so hearing these voices and being a supporting actor and nexus would be very important points to take for Nayong Filipino in charting the next steps forward. The Nayong Filipino Foundation, Dr. Buen Consejo, has a lot, quite a number of musical instruments also that we have in storage in Nayong Filipino Clark. So before we proceed, I'd like also to hear from Dr. Jocelyn Guerra from Cebu.
I think a lot has been said. I don't think I have to say much, but however, I'm just prepared my notes, but also looking at, having practiced and been engaged in museums and public education, including community. I have seen that, well, number one, the meaning of museums has changed through time. However, what's very strong, I think, in the last, I don't know, I'd say the last 20, 30 years is the idea of heritage, and people would like to know who they are, and so one of the vehicles for this is a museum. So it museums, but also in the context of trying to understand, what these collections are, or if the museum reflects, let's say, the origins of a place or a population, then it also looks into how was the collection being, being put together. And I think this is something when these questions were, when I saw the questions, I thought, I should be very honest, I was quite, there's a struggle within, because you're confronted with the history of the collection, which is quite interesting. So among this, is the collection. Normally, ethnographic materials are collected as a result of ethnographic research. So you'd have a lot of information, but in some aspects, I believe that the collections came from people who were asked to come to the plazas and bring the collection. So that is one part, like to what degree is there a document to the collections, and apparently there's none, if you will. But then it also looks into, in the light of the IPRA, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Artifacts are very important manifestations of a people's aspiration, a people's worldview, a people's ability to adapt, their adaptation to their environment. So that brings me to the question, when you look into ownership and you look into these different treaties, and when you look into the unequal, if I'd say the inequality in the collection, if you will, sometimes when sometimes people are so trusting, and this is something that is good, but on the one hand, this becomes a very uneasy relationship later, because what happens when people collect, or someone comes and collects, but then does not bring it to a museum, In fact, in my experience working in Leyte before, and in some parts of Mindanao doing some field work with Bayon Griffin, this is always the problem among indigenous, I think, not only indigenous people, but people tend to believe that if you tell them that you will be, sorry, if you tell people that you're collecting this for government, or you're doing a museum, then they are very, they're very excited, to do that. But I see, when I look back into that, I'd say that, sometimes maybe it's their kindness is being exploited. And what happens is, it is already a story. The narrative is not even the narrative of the people whom you collected this, but it's even the interpretation of that narrative. So therefore, the narrative is not really of the people, but but that of whoever is writing about it, and based on um, the insights. No, second is, I think I'd go back to the first presentation, no, of being the first presenter, Mr. Bueza, if I, because there is now the next question is, if we want to be, if we want to come to terms and address, if you will, no, the sins of the past. I'm using that in a loose term, okay? So don't, but what are we going to do with it? Will this be returned? But then the question is, if it's going to be returned, will the collection be safe in the hands of the people that you have? Because we have seen, I've seen a lot of artifacts that is being bought or traded by people who are, you know, they just wanted a basket, for example, can be sold for like 100 pesos because they need money. So these are the questions. So it's you know, I'm having really a conflict here. I would like to return it, but the question is, are they ready to be able to accept that? Now, the other thing is going back into the context of heritage. The moment you return it to the people, you will also be, I think, depriving a certain population of the access of this artifact. Okay, so and this is something that I think Nayong Filipino will really have to look into. Is there a compromise somewhere that can be done? And then, of course, the ethics of collection. You know, some of these collections have been is already there. I think it's important to just make peace with the past. You cannot change anything with it, but then take care of the collections and put these collections in a context in which everyone will understand, but learn from how these collections were taken from the people from the people of the community. Now, I think last is I see museums as agents of change and development, which is the theme now of this year. And for me, I see museums also as vehicles of cultural understanding. Now, how will these collections now be able to help build a wider Philippine context? You know, we're broken up into different ethnolinguistic groups, but how are we now going to our culture, the one aspect of Philippine society's spectrum of culture? I think that's what I have.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Dr. Guerra. Dr. Guerra is also raising questions on public access in response to the question that we all have on the possibility of returning some of the objects to communities or networking further with communities. Just for the benefit of all the attendees here, when Dr. Guerra mentions things like the sins of the past, to quote, not the sins of the past, we are referring to some of the findings that we have concerning the history of the collections. So in particular, I would like to cite an article published by the NCCA. It was an article written by Dayang Iraula on an account where Dr. David Baradas was asking communities to come to the plaza and bring some of the objects that they have, some of the heirlooms that they have. So that's the context during the early years of the museum. Before we proceed any further, last but not the least, I would like to hear and learn from Dr. Nestor Castro.
Good afternoon, Dr. Laya, and to my co-panelists, as well as to everyone in this Umpukan. Well, I'm happy to find out that the Nayong Filipino Foundation is trying to reflect on its role in society and looking at its own heritage and legacy. But the Nayong Filipino Foundation has to reckon with its Marcosian legacy, its shaded past. We know very much that the PANAMIN had many conducted many activities that we would now consider as unethical. So we have to understand what was the ideology of PANAMIN before, why was it establishing a museum, why is it collecting artifacts. Of course, we could not do this discussion today. So this will help us understand how were these artifacts taken from the community, what were bought, were they paid, and then for donations, for example, where did the donors get their own artifacts. I have seen the inventory of materials that you sent to me. I don't know if that is complete or it's really like that, very incomplete, where we really have a problem of provenance. So for example, it would say this is from the Manobo, but doesn't say which particular Manobo subgroup or which particular village or from which particular Manobo person. So it's really very problematic because in the past, reflecting on anthropology's own stance in the past, anthropologists in the past tended to look at indigenous communities as homogeneous communities, but they're not. So it's uh, an overgeneralization that if you find one artifact in this village, therefore other villages belonging to the same ethnic group will have it. We know that's not necessarily true. So again, we have to look at what were brought into the museum. I don't know if you could still do what were collected by PANAMIN personnel, but were not brought into the museum. I have many uh, oral stories from my former professors. I don't know whether they are hearsay or they are truth. Some of them have also worked with PANAMIN and with Nayong Filipino before, wherein they would claim that whatever Manda Elizalde thought as collected material, but this is good for my own personal collection, then that's his. It's not with the Nayong Filipino Museum, or whatever Madame Imelda wants, she would also acquire. So there has to be culpability of the Nayong Filipino in returning to the community and saying what transpired in the past. So this is dealing with the past. Now, on returning objects per se, I'm not so sure if that can be done because we don't really know where they are taken from. But I know of one model that was done by the Sarawak Museum where they took photographs of their artifacts, went back to the field, and showed these photographs, not the real objects. But then they got a lot of stories from the people. This is in Malaysia. Of course, some would say, yes, that is owned by my grandfather, and government personnel just told my grandfather, I'll borrow it, but it was never returned to us. So we have to find out these stories. I fully agree with Dr. Tenten when she said, if communities want them repatriated, then so be it. But if they themselves will say, no, uh, we cannot take care of it anymore. Let me add on to what Dr. Buen Consejo mentioned about properties. In my field work among the Kalinga, of course, there would be different types of ownership. So there will be communal or ownership of certain properties, including heirloom objects. There will be family or extended kin ownership, but there will also be personal properties. So we have to distinguish these objects that were retrieved from the field, what particular type of property ownership do they belong to from the community where it was taken? Because if it was just a personal property of a certain family, then maybe it is the consent of the descendants of that family, whether they will allow Nayong Filipino to continue holding that particular item or now owning that particular item, and not necessarily consult everyone in the entire ethnic group. So again, sometimes there's an over romanticization that indigenous peoples always have a concept of communal ownership of properties. I think we have to distinguish different ones. For example, certain musical instruments, of course, they're very personal to the maker of that musical instrument, or the one to whom that musical instrument was gifted to, but not necessarily, this is owned by the entire Tingian tribe, because, of course, that belongs to a different category of ownership. So these are my thoughts right now. Uh, Maybe in the second or third portions on how to move forward, we could discuss about steps that need to be taken. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Castro. And personally, I would like to hear some of the oral accounts of our professors in anthropology on the history of the collection and their involvement in PANAMIN. So I would like to have a chat with you one of these
Yes.
days. Dr. Castro thankfully brought issues on navigating the different types of ownerships in communities and emphasized how communities are not homogeneous. And so this is something that we need to take note of. For those of you here who are in the field of museum studies, maybe you have your own community museum, or you are working on a collection in your own locale. You also mentioned that the importance of reflecting on our role in society, and especially for Nayong Filipino, which has a shaded past, as you mentioned. Just for the benefit of everybody, we gave a cross-section of the collection to our panelists before this talk. We did not give the whole inventory because there are quite a lot. There are thousands of objects in the collection. So what we did was just to sample, to do I call it a Noah's Ark, to sample the collection, have a few objects here and there, according to their typologies as they appear in the current inventory that we have. I'd like to hear from Patricia Panganiban, just for the benefit of everybody. Maybe, Patricia, you can tell us what objects do we have in the collection, and what's the state of the collection now? What's the state of the inventory when you first joined Nayong Filipino?
Hi, everyone. So so as we mentioned earlier in the slides, we have around 2,700 artifacts. Further divided into the categories. So the categories that we have listed are based on the previous inventories of the Philippine Museum of Ethnology, as was listed before. So we have textiles, agricultural weaving implements, musical instruments, personal ornaments, ritual items, hunting and warfare, baskets, domestic items, and personal ornaments. So overall, I think out of the items that we've shown before was, I think we showed the cross-section that we showed the panelists. That's just only like a small part of the collection. And actually what we showed are things that we actually have more information on. So when Dr. Castro was talking about how like our information was lacking and was vague, that we don't have like the specific subgroups of the different ethnolinguistic groups, actually probably less than 50% of our artifacts actually have anything identified. A lot of them actually don't have anything written other than the number, the session numbers, and like the type, the category. So yeah, so the state that they were in, so when we came into Clark around December, I remember a lot of the artifacts have been in storage since Clark had been in renovation for a year or so, and most of the artifacts were in storage, and the state of preservation was they're not really that well preserved currently. We're trying to remedy that now while we're trying to reassess the inventory as we're going along, but definitely a lot of the items are a little bit not that preserved that well, unfortunately, over time. Again, I don't know exactly how it was handled before we came in, but like in terms of inventory, we haven't found like previous inventories or like complete inventories, as well as sort of like any other additional papers, like documentation of like where these artifacts come from over the last few years. I think our oldest inventory is actually 2002, so it's pretty recent if you think about the history of the collection, starting in the 70s and 80s. And I mean, in terms of acquisition information, also, we don't have that much information. We have some items that explicitly state that they're from PANAMIN. Others have donors stipulated, but it's very few. Less than 20% of the artifacts actually have any donor information listed. So that's the challenge that we're facing now, is sort of like trying to discover the history of the acquisition and the nature of the acquisition of the artifacts. And we've done a bit of the cross-referencing, but it's still a challenge, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Patricia. And I agree. Just for the benefit of the attendees, some of the recurring names in the inventory are the following. We have Luz Deminda Santa Maria. We also have, I think this was erroneously documented, R. Bailisis. And R. Bailisis is marked as vendor. That's the exact term in the inventory. There's another recurring name, Bailosis. Bailosis is marked anti-collector in the inventory. We have another recurring name, Regalado Ireto Jose, in the old inventory when we first encountered here. And last but not the least, just another recurring name, we have A. Madale. And then the indicator there, donor of Rinti Maranao bracelet. As we said, a lot of the items that you find in the inventory just names particular ethnolinguistic groups without really indicating which community or which area they were from. Now, so aside from this, some of the recurring items in the inventory, we have PANAMIN multiple times, and then we also have acquisition values written in the inventory, but most of these were left blank. So the nature of the acquisitions, we are trying to find out how much of these were bought, donated, because an acquisition price, there not many would have acquisition prices on them, and some of them are left blank. And also when we encountered the collection, yes, that's Abdullah Madale. When we encountered the collection in December 2019, some of the items were already missing. Some were unaccounted for. Yes, so I see people in the chat box giving their inputs. Thank you very much. Yes, Abdullah Madale. The Bailisis entry there, now we believe that's Terry Bailosis. But we need to verify, of course. So that's it, more or less. Now, for the benefit of the public, that's the information that we have right now. So thank you very much for the inputs. I'd like to express my gratitude to the panelists. Perhaps we can move on to question number 2. Question number 2 is, how can museums engage the public and produce critical dialogues about the collection? So can we start again, unless can we start with Vinci Queza once again?
Yeah. Before I answer the second question, is it possible for me to react to to the other panelists? Because there is a feeling that this is usual among museum practitioners, that in the issues of repatriation, um, there's a feeling that the communities will not be able to preserve or to take care of the objects. I'd like to share, I think, if you let me, can I share a picture?
Sure, sure.
I've been working with a family in Lake Cebu, Barangay Klubi in Lake Cebu. And this particular family, sorry. Is it sharing now? No. Okay. So I'm showing a picture. This is the Gono Tembol. Below is a kindergarten. And it's quite interesting how this came about, because they have an organization of women weavers, Tinalak weavers. So these Tinalak weavers had a problem because they've organized themselves. So in the mornings and in the afternoons, they are weaving. So they have a problem on how to take care of their children because they're busy weaving. So they said, okay, let's build a kindergarten. This is all by themselves. The decisions are made by these women. So they asked for solicitations. The building was constructed. The design was by them. This was designed by them. No? Below is a kindergarten, and upstairs you'll see it's a community museum. It started with a collection of a certain family, all gongs. So you see here, these are betel nut cases and some singkil, mga foot ornament. No? And so what happens is, because there is now a collection of this particular family, all the other families in the village all pitched in. So mas dumami ang nasa collection nila. But what's really interesting in this particular community museum is they're not in glasses, they're not in boxes, because the kindergarten downstairs, the kindergarten students would go up to the museum and use these objects. They play with these objects because playing is a form of learning for them. Now, so they touch it and they use it. And these are actually brought down, these gongs, they're brought down whenever there are ceremonies, there are special occasions in the community. And so the real intent and the real meaning of these objects are brought back to life, kumbaga. This is a hall in that upstairs museum. This is all the traditional Tinalak designs. And the Tinalak weavers, the women weavers in that association, they would go to this upstairs museum and check the patterns. No? So ginagamit nila ulit ang patterns to recreate old textiles. So this is an example of when those gongs are brought down and used for the purpose that they were actually created. Now, so there are communities that are ready to take care of these objects and to use them again for the purpose that they were created. No? But to answer the question on how to engage the public and produce critical dialogues about the collection, we're now online. Even this Umpukan is online. So I think because of this COVID situation, this pandemic, many of our activities will be online. So I think platforms that the Nayong Filipino Foundation can engage the public in would be in online platforms like this Umpukan, webinar sessions, no, with specific topics on the history of your collection, but also social media, so info materials that you can post. So there's also a comment or a feedback mechanisms of the social media, so that you can have social engagement and participation from your audience, or also followers, but also a website, um, a good website for news, or also for uploading of knowledge products or other IEC materials for public awareness. There are also online materials on videos, so you can pair objects with videos of how the gong was actually used, how those musical instruments were used or were produced. Also infographics, news, and feature articles that you can post on your websites. But ultimately, my hope is engaging means you're raising the awareness on the plight or the injustices that's been committed or still being committed to indigenous peoples here in Mindanao, especially. Many are still victims of war. Many are still victims of displacements here in Mindanao. Ang taas ng displacement here in the island. And from this course, no, we move hopefully to collective action.
Thank you, Vinci. You raise an important point here, not just the museum as a platform for collections and exhibition, but the museum as a platform for healing, especially now that a lot of communities in Mindanao are still facing systemic oppression, as you mentioned. We would love to link with communities. I think this will be crucial in the way we co-produce knowledge with the communities, and to have a better sense of the collection, and to create narratives on the objects of the collection that we have. So I'd also like to hear from Tenten Mina.
Thank you. Well, first, I'd like to say that that was a great example that Vinci showed of a community museum, because I think that there really is a lot of possibility for direct engagement, of course, when your stewards of objects are also the people who really use the material as well. In regards to engaging the public and creating dialogue about maybe the Nayong Filipino Foundation's collection, you can approach it, I think, from a two-pronged approach. Of course, you can directly engage first and foremost with people who are deemed as specialists, perhaps, because I think in some ways they're actually easier to contact coming from an area like Manila, but it's also so much more meaningful if you can also crowdsource information directly coming from, again, the people that produce this material to begin with. So an interesting example of this, I think, is what they're doing with the Field Museum in Chicago. So they have what they call the co-curation initiative, where the Philippine collections, which were accumulated or collected rather from the Philippines by Faye Cooper Cole and other museum directors in the early American colonial period. And a large problem that a lot of institutions face that we don't really talk about is dissociation. So it's one of the major challenges for cultural institutions, where, again, you have a loss of information as time. The people who are in charge of the care and the study of the collection also change, and a lot of information is lost because not everything is really written down. So what they've been doing since I think the first time we heard of the digital co-curation initiative of the Field Museum was circa early 2012, 2011, around that time. So what they've been doing is they've been trying to crowdsource information from the Filipinos, first in the US, and of course internationally also, if anyone can share stories that they know are related to the collections that are in the Field Museum's holdings. So what the Nayong Filipino Foundation is doing by first and foremost, of course, trying to sort through your records is the most important step, because for people to know what you have, you first have to put it out there. So yeah, I guess that's what I'd like to say at this point. And yes, of course, digital platforms are very much necessary for us to be able to, of course, start these initiatives as well and reach out.
Thank you. Excellent examples from Kenten and Vinci as well on communities who are ready. I'd also like to hear from Dr. Guerra. Oh, Dr. Guerra, your audio is on mute.
Okay. I have one or three slides actually to, if I may share.
Sure.
Well, this is, I think when you look into a collection which does not have much knowledge, it's like really doing an archaeology again, no? So you
I
have to
agree.
so there's a method which is, this is really archaeology in its nature, but it uses ethnographic um, method, no? So what happens is the collections that you have, for example, which does not have so much, can actually be brought back, as pointed out by Miss Mina earlier, no, brought back into the community, and let the community, ask the community, what is this? What is this material? So then they would have the chance to be part of reconstructing the history. They might, especially when the collection comes from a small community, they will be able to remember someone. And, this is where methods in science is used, so that you can triangulate the information. So what happens is you will have a variety of observed human activities and material remains. Then it is able to generate your data, which you can use for inferences. So that I think 50, well, if you started 1971, it's around 50, 60 years, 50 years. So there should be people who would believe, or grandchildren of people. And this is very important. Now, why am I so passionate about this? It's because, when you work, in the work that I've done with museums, sometimes what you have, the collection is not well documented. Now, what are you going to do with those? You cannot also just throw it away. I mean, so what we did with some was to really go back, and there are very interesting insights that we get. So what happens is you have an artifact and you linked it to the society who produces it or may have similar, and then do the inference from there. Now, second, I think what we have is I think the Sugbo Chinese Heritage Museum, in terms of engaging the public, for a very long time, museums are quite a space, no, diba? There's a time in museums na parang elite lang, pag educated ka, pwede ka sa museum or you can understand. So there was this, no? So a few years ago, we wanted to make the museum more accessible, no, to the public. So in Cebu, what we did was to do design an event. It's a cultural event called Gabi Isa Kabilin, which was really not an, it was a it's spiritual grandparents, or actually the Langinak, the long night of museums in Europe, who were also trying to bring back the public into engaging with being interested in the museums at a time when, with the reunification of Germany, there was not enough money to generate, so they need to entice the public back. Now, but what happens is for example, a space like Cebu, where it has become a center of trade, it has its population grew by leaps and bounds. That so what happens is, but what do we want to do? A museum as a center for, as a vehicle for change, or a vehicle for understanding, a vehicle for connection. So what we did was to open the museums. There's an event in which people can come to the museum, especially at night, in a relaxed manner. Now, for here, when we did Sugbo Chinese, when it was first opened, there was also a lot, people were quite excited. It was a very small community, people of 1 million, but they were still really small. So what happens was, for people to gain, to gain their participation and to get their stories, even when the museum was not done, it was still under construction, but of course safe for people to enter. That's very important. Was we opened the grand lobby just to give them an idea and for them to be at home in the museum. So then of course that oh, sorry, this was the, this is what it is today. And then of course that artifact, why well, that's a recreation, a replica of a junk. And for us, it is not just an artifact. A lot of people say, okay, that's just a junk, but no, it's for us. It's when you enter the museum, this is for you as a part of the community or as a visitor to the, as a guest to the museum. You're part of the journey that this museum will take. So they are being engaged, no, in how we go about our collection. So I think in engaging the public, it's very important that they can the language used has to be a language that they can understand. And what happens is today, especially with COVID-19, it has accelerated the presence of, or the connectivity of people via the internet or via social media. So I'd like, well, it's a very bad situation we are in, but a lot of people are now moving into looking at collections in a certain museum, or museums have become in fact accessible because of COVID-19, and they are making materials now. I think that's I have.
Thank you, Dr. Guerra, for these concrete strategies that you shared on the SCHM as a vehicle for connecting to a wider spectrum of the community related to theories in participation in museums and co-creation and digital engagement. So I'd like to hear also from Dr. Buen Consejo. Can you share some of your experiences in the ethnomusicology department in UP?
I guess I will just respond to what Vinci and Dr. Tenten had said earlier, because both are solutions. Like Vinci talks about the repatriation and then the re-socialization of these objects in the modern community, the here and now of the communities that still find those objects meaningful, because now it's tied into kindergarten activity, which is a very good means. And then this idea of co-curation of the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, I actually looked at it because I'm aware of that co-curation, because one of the facilitators used to be one of our fellows. I mean, he was writing his dissertation in the College of Music, Dr. Neil Mathern. So he's one. I saw his picture there recently, but I noticed that the co-curation, I think it's not, there are only a few participants, and I think the announcement, the events, I actually browse the co-curating activity, related to the 10,000 objects. And people does not have a memory of this object, because I think there's some kind of a dissociation. What the Filipino American communities are giving to the Field Museum are the lowland material culture, like a T-shirt from UP and all this stuff. So I was just quite shocked between the disassociation between those who can remember. It's a complex story, but it might be that those who were able to access travel and migrate to America are also the ones who do not share that the indigenous cultures. But I'm not sure how it happened. I can ask Dr. Neil Mathern. So co-curating, I think it's the way to go, because that's the only form by which there will be a shared space, and then there's interaction, there's dialogue, there's it fosters this critical thinking about this the issue of the stories that will bind those objects. Whose stories are we really I think the Nayong Filipino has to support the stories, because that's the only means by which there's life to the objects, rather than presenting them, you know, like physically, without really knowing the context, the ethnographic context by which those objects have significances, you know. So, so I did not add anything. I just reinforced two possible solutions by which Nayong Filipino Foundation can go forward, you know, vis-a-vis the question, the second question that Dr. Bukiri had been requesting us to share an opinion. You know. That's all.
Thank you, Dr. Buen Consejo. You raised really important points on collective memory and how the public resonates with certain objects that are displayed in museums. Last but not the least, I would like to hear from Dr. Castro.
Of course, the National Nayong Filipino Foundation has multiple publics. I don't know if you have already done a stakeholder mapping of who your stakeholders are and what their interests are. So their interests will vary. So the interests of museum goers, probably for entertainment, for art appreciation, will differ from students who want to learn something based on a requirement in their course, different from those of museum practitioners, including scientists, technicians, etc., and communities. Now, talking about communities, you have already identified from which communities most of your artifacts have come from. And there would be a means to engage with these communities. Since we don't know the exact name of the village, so we throw a wider net uh, in these areas, and also do some research on where PANAMIN stations were based in the past, in what areas or villages they conducted research. So it's a two-way process. One is because you have a research arm doing that research on the history of your museum, but also engaging with academic institutions within this that cater to these communities. So, for example, when I was doing my dissertation in Kalinga, I have encountered the name of PANAMIN several times. But during that time, I was not interested in material culture or artifacts that were retrieved from Kalinga. So I tended to brush that information aside. I focused more on political systems and ethnicity issues. So those who are in the field can be tapped by asking them from your data in the field, what have you learned about the role of the PANAMIN before or later, the Nayong Filipino Museum then in your areas, so that we could see an interface of information on understanding the present collection of the Nayong Filipino. So engaging with the communities could be done in many ways. You could go to the community itself. You could bring community members into your museum. You could co-curate. You could co-research. Because many among the public think that the role of the museum is only in terms of exhibition, and they are not familiar that actually exhibition is just a small portion of the task of a museum. There's a bigger function of researching and taking care of these artifacts. So doing joint researches, whether with academic institutions or with communities themselves, or both, is something that can be done as part of engaging the public.
Thank you very much for these insights, Dr. Castro. Certainly, these recommendations that we have from our panel of experts, such as stakeholder mapping, the need to go back to the field, hopefully when the pandemic's over, something I'm missing right now. And the need for joint researches, certainly these go into checklists and the planning of the programs and projects of the Nayong Filipino Foundation. We are down to our last general question, and if it's okay for the panelists to extend a bit, we would like to extend a bit because sayang yung opportunity, and we would like to hear their recommendations. Also, we would like to entertain questions from our attendees. So for our last question, it's closely related to the second question actually, but I think this has to do with very specific tactics that we can employ in the Nayong Filipino Foundation. And this is it. How can virtual museums support the relations that link objects in a collection to persons and society? So we are now thinking of having virtual platforms for the Nayong Filipino Foundation alongside as we go through the research process. So that's what we want to ask our panelists. Can I start with Vinci?
I think COVID-19 will have a long and lasting effect on the forms and functions of museums and other cultural institutions. This, I think we have to accept. But in virtual museums, Nayong Filipino Foundation is planning to have a virtual museum. I think we have to prepare for the huge loss of the actual experience of going to the museum physically. You actually lose the actual experience of actually seeing the object, and also experiencing the museum space. You lost this. You will actually lose some things that are required para full experience of the museum. Digital museums can provide access to all types of collections and content. Yet we have to go back to the purpose of the virtual museum in the first place of the Nayong Filipino Foundation. Is it for entertainment, for education? Because the museum experience should still be anchored on the purpose of the museum. And also the cognitive ability, I think, and the learning style of the spectator, who's your, sabi nga ni Sir, the stakeholders, no? What are the learning styles of the spectators? We also have to be aware of the public's motivation to visit a virtual museum or discover an online museum. Is it something that's new? I've been to, if you check Google Arts and Culture, it's an app. There are different museums from all over the world. So what is new here in the virtual museum of the Nayong Filipino? So these are questions we have to answer. We also now have to consider how long will the attention span of the public be? No? Kasi like for me, when I'm browsing the the Google Arts and Culture app, it would take you around siguro 10 minutes to browse, and that's it. The experience is you're just focused on a computer screen or cell phone. So I think the NPF should have strategies to maintain the attention of the visitor. How do you create interactivity? How do you create this interactivity in digital tours? Could it be music or could it be videos linked to the object? But in virtual tours, if you will have virtual tours, it is no longer about going from point A to point B like in a museum, from here to there. No? Because a person is definitely affected by various external stimuli. If there's an advertisement while you're watching the virtual tour, then you click on the advertisement, then you're in another browser. No? So ano ka na, distracted. The visitor circulates within an exhibition according to her or his own preconceptions. May mga preconceptions ang visitor. But the structure of the virtual exhibition should be designed to interact with these preconceptions in order to change or rectify them. The goal of museums is to inform and motivate. Those are some learning strategies of museums. But I think for Nayong Filipino Foundation, given the past of the Nayong Filipino Foundation, it's more of to motivate, not to inspire people for action. The museum, the word museum, diba, comes from the Greek museon. the seat of the muses. It's the seat of inspiration. The Nayong Filipino Foundation Virtual Museum, what do you seek to inspire among the visitors, given the shady past, no, of the collection? So if ever there will be one narrative for the Virtual Museum of Nayong Filipino, it should be the honest telling of the tangled stories of things that are in your collection.
Thank you. Definitely, we will be honest about our past and we'll try our very best to design non-linear experiences for the public. In line with that, I'd also like to hear from Tenten.
Yes. So I'd just like to comment first on what Dr. Buenconsejo said earlier about the Field Museum, because I know that, yes, they launched it a few years ago. It's a little confusing when you look at their portal, I think. And it seems that there's not much activity, but I think that the capacity of that platform is really for them to get information from the community potentially. But of course, that will require a lot of weeding through a lot of the information that passes, of course, that is passed online. And there have been several encounters where we've had representatives from the Field Museum coming back to the Philippines trying to look for direct contacts so that they can also get in touch directly with communities throughout the archipelago as well. Now, to go back to the third question, which is about virtual museums, or the capacity of virtual museums for engaging the public and creating these connections. As Vinci had said, of course, using the internet is in a way a great equalizer for many, because it allows access where physical boundaries exist. However, it's also important to acknowledge that, of course, the access online is very different from your encounter of a physical object. Because one of the most important values of museum collections is, of course, their ability to allow the viewer a direct connection to the past because of the well, it's actually manifested in the authenticity of the object and the direct contact with the object, which is representative of a specific culture or of a specific period in history. And that is not necessarily translated in online experiences. But what it does offer, of course, is a lot of interactivity, which you don't have in physical spaces, because we, of course, because of conservation concerns, we also face a lot of challenges in terms of how much access is allowed to visitors, even within a physical museum space. Of course, because we're trying to safeguard objects, we also have to consider, lighting, humidity, so on and so forth, and a lot of other technical aspects. But the digital space allows viewers to look at all of these facets in different ways, because then it's easier for online content to focus on, let's say, for example, breaking down the physical material. It becomes easier because you can really create a subset of what it is you want to discuss with your audience. But going back to that, it's really important to also really highlight what is it that your audience is most interested in. As Dr. Castro and as Vinci had also expressed, it's going back to understanding who exactly are your stakeholders, what are their interests, and what are their goals as well when it comes to engaging with your programs. And with regards to engaging with programs, there are also studies that show that because people are so used to very interactive media and things being very readily available, you can only capture their attention for 15 minutes or so, and then you already have to sort of find ways to pull them back in. So these are some of the challenges that come with virtual spaces. But of course, it has its own many advantages as well. So I'm not sure that's a very specific answer with regards to how you can help, or rather how Nayong Filipino can sort of put that together. But these are just some general experiences that we're also experiencing when it comes to considering our own programming. Thank you.
Thank you, Tenten. Yes, I've seen some posts of Ayala Museum on Minecraft, and I find that very interesting. And also the recent programming that you do in Ayala Museum and the way you engage musicians, it's something that inspires the Nayong Filipino Foundation as well. Speaking of music, I'd like to hear from a musicologist, Dr. Buen Consejo.
I think a lot of the basic ideas have been told, you know. I just hope that this virtual museum should be filled with stories. Otherwise, if what is presented are just disembodied objects, I mean, no one will be interested in those things. So there has to be stories from the culture bearers, you know. We have to let their voices speak through your channel, you know, speak, even if it's confronting that 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 bad thing in the past, you know, like you know, grabbing, like theft, you know, requiring people, forcing them to submit, you know, to power, give me the object, you know. I think that has to be confronted. Stories like that, I think, would make the objects, you know, exist in a particular in very specific time and place, you know. And then by seeing those critical voices, then we begin to appreciate, you know, the value of what a museum should be. It shouldn't just be a space for propaganda, you know. It has to be the people, you know, their stories, because this heritage is theirs, you know. Unless we can convince them to speak, you know, that it is their heritage, I don't know if we can go quite radical steps, you know, towards a better, a healthier dialogue, you know. So I didn't say much, but it's just this, you know, my contention against, you know, showing objects without the context, you know, but that make them meaningful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buen Consejo. Actually, you said a lot. You said something quite meaningful about the need for objects not to be disembodied objects and to fill these virtual platforms with stories, co-created narratives given by the community themselves. And you also raised an important point on investigating the exhibitionary order and the power dynamics that transpire between museums and communities. And I am reminded, when you were giving these comments, I am reminded by, and I just like the public to know, the grave markers that we have in the Nayong Filipino Foundation collection. So if you go to our Facebook and if you go to our Nayong Filipino Foundation Instagram account, our project officers can give the links for that. You will find some of these objects that we're having there. You know, so please feel free to comment, share, so that we can generate more conversations about these objects. We are releasing, for example, videos on grave markers precisely to solicit comments from the public, not just to entertain, no, definitely not, and not just to not to entertain, definitely not to just work on the technical aspects, because anyone can work on technical aspects, but research is something that the Nayong Filipino is trying to do right now. And also, we want to engage the public and have the public comment on these objects that are with us. I'd also like to hear from Dr. Guerra. You're on mute, yes.
Okay. Okay. I think a lot has already been said, but I'd like to dovetail on what Dr. Bukirin was saying, no, that actually those grave markers, no, was something like what crossed my mind was, this is my headstone being put in a museum when it's not supposed to be there, or something like that, no? And it pained me when I saw that. But you know what can you do? But it's a very important artifact that has lost its provenience, if you will, no? So these are so in this context now, virtual museums allows us to have accessibility to a collection which normally in normal, in day-to-day operations of the museum can sometimes not be seen. Uh, but at the same time, so it should be used as a vehicle for interaction with the stakeholders. Now, this is where this is really going to be a multi-layered set, no? Because, for example, if as a practitioner, if I look into the needs of today's education, like children, for example, our museums could be a very good resource for information, in fact, coloring books and the like. But if you have that as your age group, for example, but how many, like, to what degree will the internet platform, be able to support? No, also because of fluctuations of bandwidth and the like. But given that that is possible, then I think for me, I'd like to play for really working with. I have, my heart is with the public school children, especially who will not have access to such, artifacts. And yet, this is probably something that's very near to them. Would be, I think, one age group I'm really looking into. But also at the same time, then it has to be done with very good photographs. Second is the other one that I'm looking at. I'm very egoistic in this context. As a researcher, you see, I'm looking, for example, at maps. No, and the well photographed a map is, you can really access them online, which will give you details. So I wonder if this is part of your, part of your plan to make the object available to the public, not only as for enjoyment, but also for people to have a much clearer picture of that object, so that they would be able to also give you feedback in that context. No? So for me, a virtual museum is going to stay here, but I would agree with most that this is not still not, will not replace a physical presence. No, physically be in a museum. So for me, it has to be curated such that it becomes a teaser for the people to come to the museums and really see the object close at hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Guerra. Yes, on that note, I'd just like everyone to know that we also want virtual platforms to facilitate the feedback mechanism. We have the Freedom of Information Bill, of course, no, and we want a system where the public can easily give feedback on the collection that we have, and perhaps for the public to participate as we gather information about the objects in our collection. So last but not the least, I would like to hear from Dr. Castro.
I think setting up a virtual museum is very welcome right now, now that we have a pandemic, so people could not go to the museums, and museums are closed right now. But even beyond this pandemic, it has an added value. There's more accessibility for people who could not go to your museum because of transportation difficulties, so they could see your collections virtually. Um, Also, Dr. Laya mentioned that they want to be transparent. So this virtual museum gives this transparency. So members of particular communities will see, so these are where the artifacts of our forefathers are now located, or so they had those designs before, but now we don't produce that anymore. So you could engage these communities virtually. A third advantage, of course, will for the younger generation, millennials and those of the Generation Z, many of them are used to virtual presentations. They're very bored when they go to physically to museums, but they would like to look at things that they find on social media or through virtual museums. So I think it will get the interests of the younger generation. Now, that is just getting the interest, but it doesn't stop from there. I totally agree with all that has been said, that this does not replace the physical, actual museum. Now, some issues that have to be reckoned with, one is different stakeholders. How do you do that virtually? Uh, because it's more accessible, you're also more vulnerable to bashing. Or why are you displaying that? And why not this? You're stereotyping us. Okay, so this thing. So make that into consideration. Another issue that may crop up is uh, intellectual property of indigenous people. So, for example, if you make available a certain textile and the designs may be just downloaded and copied by somebody else. So how do we prevent this from happening? So what are the things that communities would like to share with other people, and what are the things, no, this is our secret, we don't want others to find out about it. I remember, this is not a virtual museum, I remember this was for Ayala Foundation before, Filipinas Heritage Library. We were sent to Palanan, Isabela to do research, and then we did a community validation before bringing back the information to Manila. So these are the AGTA. So they said, yes, you got it right. Everything was correct. However, we don't want you to share to the public about our medicinal plants because it is our secret. You got it right, but please don't share it. So I think that from the start should have been clearer. What are the things you could share and what you could not share? Unfortunately, because we have problems of provenance, so we would have to do further research about so that we could answer these questions.
Um, Thank you very much, Dr. Castro. The reminders you gave will be very useful, not just for Nayong Filipino, but for museum practitioners, students of curatorial studies, and those who are also attendees here who are running their own, for example, heritage houses, community museums. Yes, I agree. No, we are that was the last question that we have, and I just like to read some of the inputs from our chat box. Gay Jalsita suggested here, Habi, the Philippine Textile Council members, will be able to help you with labels for your objects in your collection with no labels. Yes, I agree. We hope to get their support. And virtual museums could assist in educative process of objects. It's related to what Dr. Castro was saying about community validation. So I don't see much questions from the Q&A box that we have. I'd like to invite some of my co-panelists, Kate Lim perhaps, or Patricia Panganiban, if you have questions to our panel of experts that you may have. Kate Lim. Kate Lim is heading the Cultural Leadership Institute of the Nayong Filipino Foundation. A lot of the things being mentioned here have to do with cultural rights, cultural sensitivity, and ownership of intellectual property. Kate?
Good afternoon to our panelists, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I think I just have one question. So what are the ethics of bringing intangible heritage where these objects are connected to into the museum, and how can this be realized in an online platform?
Yes, would any of the panelists like to answer that?
Maybe I could start. Actually, Dr. Ben Consejo mentioned that what is important is the stories. And the stories, of course, belong to intangible things. So the artifacts or the material objects are just the vehicles for these stories. So as you keep, as you collect and exhibit artifacts, there should be stories about them. It may be folklore about these artifacts, what they were used, especially for ritual objects. But the bottom line is, again, if the community from where it came from, if they gave you consent to share these stories to the bigger public. So if we're if we're talking about indigenous communities, so that has to pass through free and prior informed consent, which is quite tedious and problematic, I know. But what is important, just simply say that community agreed that we would like to share that story to the bigger public. And if they gave you consent, then I think then that's a go. Now, the second step will be how these stories will be represented. For example, this is where creative imagination comes into play. You hire an artist to draw a caricature or a comic book. Again, I think you have to go back to the source from where it came from. Do you agree as to how it looked like? Because with all good intentions, sometimes the community will say, but we don't look like that. Because they're not familiar, for example, with artistic license and caricatures. So the safe way really is every now and then. So it's not a one-time process. Every now and then, you go back to the community or the source.
Thank you, Dr. Castro. Would anyone else among our panel of experts like to share?
I'd like to share just well, I have always I'm a big fan of cultural maps because essentially this really gives you these are already processed information. A proper cultural map is processed information that you can also use in museums. So that what happens is you have all the information there, and you also have the a dialogue already done with the community. But I don't believe, well, there's a lot of intangible, like, rituals, for example, no, which is an intangible heritage for rice. I remembered when I did in Leyte, they said, the informant said, I will allow you to write this down, but you cannot tell the secret of, of where we are doing this. So, in fact, at that point, this was like 20 years ago. So you can give, so for me, in that information was saying, you can tell what you have said, but you cannot have so much the details, no, into that. So it's kind of difficult. So what we ended up was explaining rice rituals with broad strokes, no? So something along these lines, which was acceptable to the group that we have responded. So that's.
Thank you, Dr. Guerra. Anyone else among our panel of experts who would like to share?
Hi, yeah, I think I'd just like to comment that, again, it goes back to what was said earlier about the importance of community validation. And I think this is something that's also been stressed in a lot of recent online discussions with members of the different indigenous communities, that there is a lot of information that is accessible through written reports, publications, but there is still a lot more information about rituals which are more dear to the community that they don't want to be just out there for very specific reasons. So I suppose it really depends on how you'd want to approach the particular project you're doing. If you want to maybe create a framework first and then present it to them and then see if it's viable, or if there are other methods that you'd like to employ for your different programs.
Thank you, Tenten. Dr. Buen Consejo and Vinci, would you like to share? Dr. Buen Consejo.
Laya, may I share?
Okay, sure.
Yeah, it has been pointed out already. It will be a tedious process, but I'd like to share from experience, no, especially if you're dealing with oral narratives. These are intangibles. One of those intangibles. Especially if you're dealing with oral narratives, the nature of oral narratives really are they change, especially if there will be many versions of an oral narrative of a story, and once you write them down, they're already there, it's set. No, so it will not change anymore because you've written them down already. But oral narratives, if you actually go to the communities, for example, in Lake Cebu, I've been asking the story of Boi Henwu, one of their heroes in their mythology. But there will be many variations. Like she went to heaven. Others, she became the lake of Cebu. But there will be many variations. And actually, I just had a conversation with someone who used a written account that I had in my thesis. So with so he asked if he can use it for his YouTube, what they call this YouTube channel. So gumawa siya ng story in YouTube. And then there was one Tiboli who actually commented, that's not the version, that's not the right version. But actually that version came from a certain person whose grandmother passed it down to her. So there will be many versions of an oral narrative. So that's why the validation is very important. There's another story, the story of Fiue and Sidekwe. This is Blaan community. But this is a project for the SMI. I know it's a mining company. But it was a tedious process where they had to collect a single story of Fiue and Sidekwe, and then they had to go there to the community for several sessions to ask for the story itself, to ask to validate the translation, but also the illustration of the story. So they had to check if in the illustration it was the proper attire for a datu, for a goddess, or so that will be the process that you'll be undertaking.
Thank you, Vinci. Dr. Buen Consejo, would you like to share anything? Ay, Dr. Buen Consejo, nag-stop video po kayo. Ayun. I think you will need to unmute.
Actually, basic ideas have been said already, so I cannot add more. I mean, as Vinci said, it becomes very tedious. And indeed, storytelling is contingent, to the circumstances of performing them. So, but yet we have to really, the validation is important. I just like to affirm that, because there's no problem with that, and in fact, that is the way to go, unless we go back to the old sin, of muting our research associates. So I have nothing to add, Dr. Bukirin.
Thank you, Dr. Buen Consejo. There's a question here: if there are ongoing projects by young emerging creative groups and teams that are aligned with this topic, would it be possible to approach Nayong Filipino Foundation that these groups? Definitely, we would love to have more. We would love to involve the youth more, actually, for these ongoing projects. This Umpukan sa Nayon, No Object Unturned, is only the first of our series. We have been asking several specialists from the field of museum, curatorial studies, ethnomusicology, anthropology, different fields, to ensure that it will be multisectoral and transdisciplinary. It's just that some of those we approached were unavailable this afternoon. And for that, we are really thankful for the panelists who made time and who allowed us to extend and for us to hear their insights. Definitely, the insights that we have this afternoon will be very helpful, not just to the Nayong Filipino, but a lot of practitioners who are at attending with us in this session. As to the next steps forward, we are constructing a fact sheet actually of not just the Nayong Filipino collections, but Nayong Filipino itself. And we will be releasing that fact sheet for the public to see within the week, actually. First things we are confronting is the PANAMIN collection, just to let you know, and just to answer the question of Gino, who asked about ongoing projects. So we are trying to see how these objects, the nature and modalities of acquisition during this time in the 1970s, and we are trying to get the public also to confront the ideology behind PANAMIN, and we feel that it is very timely since we are also celebrating April 23 and not just Museums and Galleries Month. So with that, I'd like to thank the panelists for attending and also the attendees. Rest assured that we will be giving certificates for those who completed the Nayong Filipino Foundation Umpukan sa Nayon, and we'd just like you to answer a survey for evaluation purposes. Certainly, the points that were raised this afternoon were very important to us and the attendees here, who are, a lot of them are practitioners. Some of them include the role of museums and the need to go beyond the exhibitionary order, and for museums to amplify and make more legible its role as a supporter, enabler, advocate, motivator, catalyst, among many other roles. The need for partnerships and co-production, the possibility of co-curation and multi-layering of knowledge. Definitely, we will be doing that for the next few months. And as soon as a vaccine is available, we will definitely go back to the field, right, Kate and Patricia? We will go to the field. And the need also to design interactivity, that it's not all about the technical aspects. It's not all about technology, you know. So I just like to raise that because a lot of the budgeting that we have sometimes for museums goes to technological aspects, you know, the virtual platforms and computers in museums, no? And the Nayong Filipino would not be putting would be investing on research really and stimulating conversations, genuine conversations, and gathering narratives and seeking the validation of communities on what kinds of narratives would they be comfortable about sharing, definitely, before we put this out in virtual platforms. And also, before we leave, you know, the importance of stories of culture bearers and how objects should not be disembodied objects, but should only be a medium for interaction and exchanges. And in keeping also with the Nayong Filipino Foundation values, which is participatory and inclusive. So with that, I'd just like to thank again everyone, from the panelists to my colleagues, to all the attendees who are here, and a pleasant afternoon to everyone. Thank you.